Now that we understand our context better, understand our confession, and know our identity, we're now in a place to move forward and understand this next practice that has been lost in many church practices but needs to be recovered. And it's the idea of formation, understanding how it is that we grow. How do we become disciples that follow Jesus, that know how to love well, that know how to engage well, that aren't overwhelmed by how our culture or our society tells us growth takes place, but that it's grounded in something much deeper than that. There's no question that we're always being formed. The culture around us forms us daily. But how are we to counteract that? How are we as Christians to be formed so that we can become the kind of people that know how to love God well, love our neighbor well, and therefore know how to love our communities well?
Four, how do we grow? How do we grow? And this is a question about formation, about what it means to become the fullness of what we are meant to be as human beings. And it's very important that we take this question about formation seriously, because the work of being a faithful Christian presence is not something that we simply are, it is something that we become. We need to be formed. And it's also important that we take this seriously because so many of our neighbors are asking questions about formation. We live in an age that continues to long for human perfectibility, but to have no idea how. How is it that we are to grow? Now, in our own age, we see two different types of formation, two different models that are incredibly prominent, and it's important that the Christian church understand these. The first is what you might call the therapeutic model of formation. The therapeutic model of formation. Now, this account is really driven by contemporary positive psychology, and it views the goal of formation as human happiness. The goal of formation is human happiness. And because of this, it says that the path of formation is human self-knowledge, this cultivation of insight, that we have to understand our desires, what we desire and why, that we have to learn strategies for pursuing those desires and removing things from ourselves and from our lives that diminish the possibility of those desires, and that the purpose of human life is to pursue one's path. And you see this everywhere. This therapeutic model of formation is fundamental to how so many of our neighbors and so many people in the church think. Now, in contrast to this, it's important that we recognize another model, which is what I'm going to call the technocratic model of formation. The technocratic model of formation. Now, the key insight here is that it's not fundamentally about the cultivation of inner life. It's about the cultivation of social skills, about learning certain kind of social skills, certain kinds of mastery. And so the goal is not happiness, it's something like effectiveness. And so to become a person with certain kinds of technical knowledge required for very complex tasks. Now, this is the model of formation that is employed in so many business schools and public policy schools and medical schools. This is how we form people. It's a technocratic model of formation largely driven by management theory. And so the path to formation is the cultivation of skill. The cultivation of skill in which we learn how to both see and solve problems. Look, these are so important. Both of these models are formation because we do need to cultivate insight about ourselves, and we do need to cultivate skills through which we can serve the world. And many people in the church are deeply embedded in this model of formation. But it's important that we remember that this is not yet a fully theological account of formation, a fully Christian theological account of formation, because it differs from these two in both the goals of formation and the path. And the goal of formation in the Christian tradition is love. To love God and to love our neighbors. The whole purpose of what we are doing in our efforts of formation is the goal of love. And over the course of Christian history, the path to this kind of formation has been understood as the cultivation, not just of insight, not just of skills, but of practices, of habits. And the way this works out in practices of mind, of learning and contemplation. Practices of mind, learning and contemplation. Practices of heart, of seeking God and of searching our own selves in prayer. Practices of speech, learning the ways of silence, the ways of song. Practices of body, learning both self-care and self-control. Practices of friendship, learning how to begin intimacy and learning where intimacy ends. Practices of service, learning to grow in both work and rest and letting love drive and govern these things. In the Christian tradition, almost without deviation, the spiritual model of formation has been these practices as they are sanctified by God and sustained over time. The belief that this is how we are formed. And so because of this, the Christian church has to devote itself right now to this theological account of formation, to reordering its life toward love and to cultivating in its communities the practices of love. Because it's only when we do that that we're going to be able to become the presence of love.